For 43 years, I collected every precious moment in photographs, carefully preserving memories that told the story of our family's journey. But when my daughter-in-law, Camille, threw them all in the trash, calling them dusty old junk, she had no idea she just destroyed evidence worth $2.3 million. This time, I'll make sure she learns that some junk carries secrets that can change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had just returned from my morning walk around Maplewood Gardens when I heard the commotion coming from the attic. Heavy footsteps, the scraping of boxes across wooden floors, and Camille's voice echoing through the house with that particular tone of irritation I'd grown to recognize over the past 5 years since she married my son, Oliver. "This place is a disaster," she was saying to someone on the phone, probably her sister, Juliette. "I swear, Rose has turned this house into a museum of useless memories. How are we supposed to start our new life here with all this clutter everywhere?" My heart sank. I'd been dreading this moment ever since Oliver announced they were moving back into the family home in Riverside Heights. The old Victorian house had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down from my grandmother Millicent to my mother, then to me. It was supposed to go to Oliver next, but I'd been hoping to live out my remaining years here peacefully, surrounded by the memories that made this house a home. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, each step creaking under my weight. At 72, I wasn't as spry as I used to be, but I still had enough fire in me to defend what was mine. What I found at the top of those stairs made my blood run cold. Camille stood in the center of the attic, her perfectly manicured hands on her hips, surveying my life's collection like a general planning a battlefield strategy. She was always impeccably dressed, even for dirty work, today wearing white designer jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and her green eyes sparkled with the kind of determination that spelled trouble for anyone in her path. Around her were dozens of cardboard boxes, photo albums, and scrapbooks that I'd spent decades organizing. Each box was labeled in my careful handwriting: Oliver's first steps, family vacations, 1985 to 1990, Christmas mornings through the years, Rose and Harold's wedding. Harold, my late husband, had been gone for 8 years now, but these photos kept his memory alive in ways that Camille would never understand. "Oh, Rose," she said without looking up from the box she was rifling through. Perfect timing. I was just telling Juliette how we need to modernize this space. All these old photos are taking up valuable storage room. We're thinking of converting the attic into Oliver's home office. I watched in horror as she lifted handfuls of photographs from a box marked Oliver's childhood and let them cascade back down like confetti. Wedding photos, birthday parties, school plays, family reunions, moments I'd captured with love and preserved with care, now being treated like garbage. "Those aren't just photos, Camille," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're family history, memories that can never be replaced." She finally looked at me, and I saw that familiar expression of barely contained impatience that had become her default whenever we spoke. "Rose, I understand they mean something to you, but we need to be practical. Oliver and I are building our future here, not living in the past. These dusty old albums are just taking up space." Dusty old albums? The words hit me like a physical blow. These photos document our entire family legacy. Oliver's first words, his graduation, our wedding day, Harold's military service. "And now they're just clutter," she interrupted, picking up another album and flipping through it dismissively. Look, I'm not trying to be cruel, but Oliver agrees with me. We need the space for important things. His business is expanding, and he needs a proper office setup. I felt my chest tighten with a familiar ache. This wasn't the first time Camille had made unilateral decisions about my belongings, my space, my life. Over the past 5 years, she had systematically pushed me out of family traditions, redecorated rooms without asking, and made it clear that she saw me as an obstacle to the life she wanted to build with Oliver. What hurt most was that Oliver seemed to go along with everything she wanted. My son, who used to beg me to tell him stories about his father and grandfather, who spent hours looking through photo albums with me as a child, now barely glanced at the pictures when I tried to share memories with him. Where exactly am I supposed to put 43 years of family photographs? I asked, gesturing to the dozens of boxes around us. Camille shrugged, already turning her attention to another box. There's a storage unit facility in downtown Riverside Heights. You could rent a small unit. Or, she paused, giving me a look that made my stomach drop, you could just keep the really important ones and get rid of the rest. I mean, how many pictures of the same birthday parties do you really need? That's when I saw her pull out a thick manila envelope from the bottom of one of the oldest boxes. My heart stopped. She was holding the envelope marked Property Documents, 1952, in faded ink. Inside that envelope were photographs that she had no idea were worth a fortune, pictures that proved ownership of land that had been in legal dispute for decades. "What's this?" she asked, starting to open the envelope. "Just old paperwork," I said quickly, reaching for it. "Nothing important." But Camille pulled it away from my grasp, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "If it's not important, then it can go in the trash pile with everything else." Before I could stop her, she walked over to a large garbage bag she'd positioned near the stairs and dropped the envelope inside, along with several photo albums she deemed worthless. The sound of those precious memories hitting the plastic bag echoed through the attic like a death knell. "Camille, please," I said, my voice cracking. "Those photos are irreplaceable. You can't just throw away decades of family history." She turned to face me, and for a moment, I saw something almost resembling sympathy in her expression. But it vanished quickly, replaced with the cold efficiency that had become her trademark. "Rose, I know this is hard for you, but you have to understand our position. Oliver and I are trying to build something here. We can't do that while drowning in the past. These photos served their purpose, but now they're just, well, they're junk. Old junk that's preventing us from moving forward." Old junk. The words rang in my ears as I watched her continue filling the garbage bag with my life's work. She had no idea that among those worthless photographs were images that could change everything. Pictures taken by my grandfather in 1952 of land boundaries that proved our family's ownership of a 47-acre plot in what was now the most expensive part of Riverside Heights. Land that developers had been fighting over for 20 years, offering millions to whoever could prove clear title. I'd kept this secret for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The photos showed the original fence lines, the old oak tree that still stood as a landmark, and most importantly, my grandfather standing next to the surveyor stakes that somehow had been lost from the official county records. But now, thanks to Camille's cleaning frenzy, that evidence was sitting in a trash bag, destined for the Riverside Heights municipal dump. "I think we're done here for today," Camille announced, tying up the garbage bag with a satisfied nod. "Oliver will be so pleased when he sees how much space we've cleared. We can start setting up his office equipment next week." As she headed toward the stairs, dragging the bag of my memories behind her, I felt something shift inside me. For 5 years, I'd bitten my tongue, kept the peace, tried to be the accommodating mother-in-law who didn't cause trouble. I'd watched Camille systematically erase my presence from the house I'd called home for 40 decades, all while Oliver stood by and let it happen. But this time, she'd gone too far. This time, she'd thrown away something that could secure my family's future for generations. And she had absolutely no idea what she'd just done. I stood in that empty attic, surrounded by the few boxes Camille had deemed possibly worth keeping, and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be the quiet, invisible mother-in-law anymore. I wasn't going to let my life's work be dismissed as old junk by someone who couldn't see past her own ambition. Camille thought she was clearing out clutter, but she'd actually just declared war on the wrong woman. And what she didn't know was that I had been playing a much longer game than she could ever imagine. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, I waited in the living room for Oliver to come home from his consulting firm downtown. The grandfather clock in the corner, another family heirloom Camille had repeatedly suggested we update, chimed 7 times as I heard his car pull into the driveway. I'd spent the afternoon thinking about how to approach this. How to make him understand what his wife had done without seeming like the bitter mother-in-law who couldn't let go of the past. Oliver walked through the front door looking exhausted, his dark hair disheveled, and his tie loosened around his neck. At 32, he had his father's Harold's strong jawline, but my brown eyes, though lately those eyes seemed to look right through me whenever we spoke. "Hi, Mom," he said absently, barely glancing my way as he headed toward the kitchen. "Camille texted me about the attic cleanup. Sounds like you two made great progress today."
"Oliver, we need to talk," I said, following him into the kitchen where Camille was preparing what looked like an elaborate dinner spread. She changed into a flowing emerald dress that complemented her eyes perfectly, and the dining room table was set with our finest china, the Wedgwood set that had belonged to my grandmother. "Can it wait until after dinner?" Camille interjected smoothly, placing a perfectly seared salmon fillet on Oliver's plate. "I've prepared Oliver's favorite meal, and I have some exciting news to share with both of you." I felt my stomach clench. Camille's exciting news usually meant another way she'd found to reshape our lives to fit her vision. "This is important, Oliver. It's about the photographs your wife threw away today." "Threw away? I thought you were just organizing them." Camille laughed lightly, that musical sound she used whenever she wanted to dismiss something as trivial. "Oh, Rose, you're being dramatic. We simply cleared up the clutter that was taking up unnecessary space. I saved all the truly important photos, your baby pictures, your graduation, your wedding photos with me, the ones that actually matter." "All the photos mattered," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. 43 years of family history doesn't just become meaningless because you decide it's clutter. Oliver set down his fork and looked between us with the expression of a man who'd found himself in the middle of a battle he didn't want to fight. "Mom, I know those photos meant a lot to you, but we discussed this. Camille and I need space to build our life here. We can't turn the house into a storage facility for every single memory." "Every single memory?" I stared at my son in disbelief. "Oliver, those photos included pictures of your father's military service, images of your great-grandfather who built this house, documentation of our family's entire legacy in Riverside Heights. How can you call that meaningless?" Camille reached across the table and placed her hand over Oliver's, her diamond wedding ring catching the light from the chandelier. "Rose, I understand that letting go is difficult, but Oliver and I are thinking about the future. Speaking of which," she smiled that radiant smile that had charmed my son from the moment he met her, "that's actually what I wanted to discuss tonight." She paused dramatically, clearly enjoying having our full attention. "I've been offered a position as senior curator at the Riverside Heights Museum of Modern Art. It's a prestigious opportunity that could really launch my career in the art world." Oliver's face lit up with genuine pride. "Camille, that's incredible! When do you start?" "Well, that's the thing," she said, her voice taking on that carefully modulated tone she used when she was about to ask for something significant. "I'd be away for weeks at a time, sometimes months. And with Oliver's business expanding, we both need this house to be our sanctuary, clean, organized, and peaceful." I felt the trap closing around me before she even finished speaking. "What I'm saying is," Camille continued, never taking her eyes off Oliver, "we need the house to ourselves. We need space to focus on our careers without distractions." "Distractions," I repeated slowly. You mean me? Oliver shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, it's not personal. It's just that Camille and I are at a crucial point in our careers. We need to be able to work late, entertain clients, host dinner parties without worrying about disturbing you or working around your schedule. I've lived in this house for 40 years. I raised you in this house. Your father died in the bedroom upstairs. And you want me to leave because I'm an inconvenience to your dinner parties? Camille's expression softened into what looked like sympathy, but I'd learned to recognize the calculation behind her gentle facade. Rose, I understand that letting go is difficult, but Oliver and I are thinking about the future. Speaking of which, she reached into her purse and pulled out a glossy brochure, sliding it across the table toward me. Golden Years Assisted Living Community. It's only 20 minutes away in Oakwood, and they have a wonderful program for active seniors. You'd have your own apartment, organized activities, and people your own age to socialize with. I stared at the brochure in horror. The cover showed elderly people playing cards and doing watercolor paintings, their faces beaming with artificial joy. You want to put me in a nursing home? It's not a nursing home, Oliver said quickly. It's an independent living community. You'd have your own space, but with support services if you need them. And Mom, let's be honest. This house is getting too big for you to maintain anyway. Too big for me to maintain? I looked around the kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, the living room where I decorated Christmas trees and celebrated birthdays, the hallways where I'd watched Oliver take his first steps. I've maintained this house just fine for 8 years since your father died. Camille leaned forward, her voice taking on a tone of practiced reasonableness. Rose, you're 72 years old. What happens if you fall down the stairs? What if you have a medical emergency and no one's here to help? At Golden Years, there's always someone available, and you'd have access to medical care right on site. I don't need medical care. I need my family to stop treating me like I'm already dead. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Oliver's face flushed red, and I could see Camille's jaw tighten slightly, though she maintained her composed expression. That's not fair, Mom, Oliver said. We're trying to think about what's best for everyone. You'd be happier with people your own age, and Camille and I could focus on building our future without constantly worrying about you. Constantly worrying about me. I felt something crack inside my chest. When was the last time either of you worried about me? When was the last time you asked how I was doing, or if I needed anything, or if I was lonely in this big house all by myself? Camille's composure finally slipped slightly. Rose, that's not entirely fair. We invite you to dinner every Sunday. You invite me to sit quietly while you discuss your careers and your friends and your plans, as if I'm not even there. You talk around me, not to me, and now you want me gone completely? Oliver pushed back from the table, clearly frustrated. Mom, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. We're offering you a nice place to live with people who share your interests. Why can't you see this as an opportunity instead of a punishment? Because it's not an opportunity, Oliver. It's exile. You're asking me to give up my home, my independence, and my connection to everything that matters to me so that you and your wife can play house without the inconvenience of acknowledging that I exist? Camille stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You know what, Rose? You're right. This is about us not wanting to live with someone who refuses to accept that the world doesn't revolve around her anymore. We're young, we're building careers, we're planning for our future, and yes, that future doesn't include organizing our lives around an elderly woman who can't let go of the past. The mask had finally slipped completely. This was the real Camille, the one who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to the life she wanted. Those photographs you threw away today, Camille, they weren't just memories. Some of them were important documents, family records that you had no right to destroy. She laughed, a harsh sound that bore no resemblance to her earlier musical tone. Important documents? Rose, they were faded old pictures of people no one remembers doing things that don't matter anymore. If they were so important, why were they sitting in dusty boxes in an attic? Oliver looked between us, clearly sensing that the conversation had taken a turn he didn't understand. What kind of documents, Mom? I hesitated, part of me wanting to tell them everything right then and there, but something held me back. Maybe it was the contempt in Camille's eyes, or the way Oliver seemed ready to side with his wife no matter what I said. Property records, I said finally. Family papers that might be needed someday. Property records for what? This house? Oliver and I already have the deed. We're the legal owners now, remember? You signed it over to us last year. The reminder hit like a physical blow. Yes, I had signed the house over to Oliver, thinking I was securing his future, while ensuring I could live here for the rest of my life. I trusted him when he promised I'd always have a home here. That's right, Mom. The house is legally ours now, and as the owners, Camille and I have the right to decide how it's used. We're not trying to hurt you, but we need you to understand that things have changed. I looked at my son. This man I'd sacrificed everything to raise, who I'd supported through every challenge and celebrated through every triumph, and saw a stranger. Someone who could dismiss decades of my life as easily as his wife had dismissed my photographs. So that's it then. You want me to pack up what's left of my life and move to Golden Years Assisted Living so you two can turn my family home into your personal kingdom? It's not your family home anymore, Rose. It's our family home. And our family doesn't include someone who can't accept that the past is over. Oliver reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We'll help you move, we'll visit regularly, and you'll be so much happier once you adjust to your new life. My new life, I repeated numbly, at Golden Years Assisted Living, surrounded by strangers, pretending to be grateful that my own son cares enough to visit regularly? It's a good place, Rose, Camille added, her now brisk and businesslike tone. I've already spoken to the director, they have an opening next month, and the monthly fee is very reasonable. Oliver and I would be happy to help with the costs if your Social Security isn't quite enough. The final insult. They'd already planned my exile down to the financial details, assuming I was just another elderly person living on a fixed income with no resources of my own.
What they didn't know, what neither of them had any idea about, was that I had resources they couldn't imagine. Resources that included legal ownership of land worth millions, documented in photographs that were now sitting in a garbage truck somewhere on the outskirts of Riverside Heights. I looked at both of them sitting there in my dining room, at my table, making plans for my life as if I were already too incompetent to make my own decisions. And I realized that everything I'd done for this family, every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar I'd saved and invested and protected for their future meant nothing to them. But they were about to learn that dismissing Rose Whitmore was the biggest mistake they'd ever make. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in the sterile lobby of Golden Years Assisted Living Community, watching Camille charm the facility director with her practiced smile and designer outfit. She'd insisted on accompanying me to the orientation visit, claiming she wanted to help me feel more comfortable about the transition. But I knew the real reason she was here, to make sure I actually went through with moving out. Mrs. Whitmore, you're going to absolutely love it here, gushed Director Patricia Newman, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a voice that dripped with condescending sweetness. We have bridge clubs, craft circles, movie nights, and our dining hall serves 3 nutritious meals a day. You'll never have to worry about cooking or cleaning again." The way she spoke to me, like I was a child who needed simple concepts explained slowly, made my skin crawl. But what bothered me more was how Camille nodded along enthusiastically, as if being treated like an incompetent elderly person was exactly what I deserved. During the monthly fee includes all meals, housekeeping services, and basic medical monitoring, Director Newman continued, sliding a contract across the glass coffee table. "We do require first month's rent plus a security deposit, and of course, there's the application fee." I glanced at the numbers on the contract and felt my stomach drop. $4,000 a month, plus fees that brought the total to nearly $5,000. On top of that, they wanted a $10,000 community enhancement fee that was supposedly refundable if I ever left, though the fine print made it clear that very few residents ever saw that money again. "That's quite expensive," I said, quietly, more to myself than to anyone else. Camille immediately jumped in with a bright laugh. "Oh, Rose, don't worry about the money. Oliver and I have already discussed how we'll help with the expenses. We want you to have the best care possible." The patronizing tone in her voice made me want to scream. Help with expenses? As if I were some penniless old woman who needed their charity to survive. "Actually," Director Newman said, consulting her tablet, "Mrs. Davidson here mentioned that you might need some financial assistance. We do have a state aid program for seniors with limited resources. The accommodations are slightly smaller, and you'd be sharing some common areas with other aid recipients. But it's still a lovely option." Camille's smile never wavered, but I caught the flash of satisfaction in her eyes. She'd told them I was poor. She'd arranged for me to be placed in the charity wing of this facility, like some destitute old woman who couldn't take care of herself. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Director Newman looked confused, glancing between Camille and me. "Oh, I'm sorry. Mrs. Davidson indicated that you were living on Social Security and didn't have significant assets." "Mrs. Davidson was mistaken," I replied coldly, pulling out my checkbook. "I'll pay the full amount myself." Camille's composure slipped for just a moment, her eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "Rose, there's no need to be prideful. We're family, and family helps each other." "Family helps each other," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call throwing away irreplaceable family photographs? Is that what you call forcing me out of my home so you can have your perfect life without inconveniences?" Director Newman sensed the tension and quickly excused herself, claiming she needed to prepare some paperwork. The moment we were alone in the lobby, Camille's mask finally slipped completely. "Listen, Rose, I'm tired of playing games. You can either sign that contract and move in here gracefully, or we can make this much more difficult for everyone involved." "More difficult how?" Camille leaned back in her chair, studying her perfectly manicured nails with casual indifference. "Well, Oliver and I have been discussing your mental state lately. The way you've been clinging to those old photographs, refusing to accept reality about your living situation, getting emotional over every little change we try to make to improve the house. It's concerning." The threat was clear, even though she'd wrapped it in false concern. "You're suggesting I'm mentally incompetent?" "I'm suggesting that grief affects people in different ways. 8 years is a long time to mourn Harold's death. Some people never recover from that kind of loss. They start living in the past, making irrational decisions, becoming a danger to themselves and others."
My blood ran cold. She was talking about having me declared mentally incompetent, a legal process that would strip away my rights and give Oliver complete control over my life and finances.
Oliver would never go along with something like that, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if they were true. The Oliver I'd raised would never have treated me this way, but that Oliver seemed to have disappeared the moment he married Camille. Oliver loves you, Rose, but he loves me too. And if I'm genuinely concerned about your well-being, if I show him documentation of erratic behavior, refusal to accept help, paranoid delusions about the importance of old photographs, she shrugged elegantly. He'll do what he thinks is best for you, even if it's difficult. The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. She was sitting in this cheerful lobby with its pastel walls and artificial plants, threatening to have me declared insane with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "You've thought this through quite thoroughly," I said. "I think through everything thoroughly, Rose. That's why I'm successful, and that's why Oliver fell in love with me. I make his life better by solving problems efficiently." She glanced around the lobby with satisfaction. "This is me solving our current problem." Director Newman returned with a clipboard full of forms, her professional smile firmly back in place. "Here we are. Just a few more signatures and we can get Mrs. Whitmore settled into her new home." I stared at the papers in front of me. Admission forms that would officially make me a resident of Golden Years Assisted Living, dependent on the charity of my son and daughter-in-law, relegated to the discarded senior wing of society. Forms that would complete Camille's plan to erase me from the life I'd built. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Director Newman prompted gently. "Did you have any questions about the terms?" I thought about the manila envelope sitting in some landfill, filled with photographs that proved my ownership of land worth more than this entire facility. I thought about the investments I'd been quietly building for decades, the rental properties Harold and I had purchased in downtown Riverside Heights when property was cheap, the stock portfolio I'd carefully cultivated while everyone assumed I was just another elderly woman living on fixed income. Most of all, I thought about my grandmother Millicent, who'd lived in our family home until she was 93, maintaining her independence and dignity until her final breath. She'd taught me that a woman's worth wasn't determined by her age or her willingness to be convenient for others. "Actually," I said, setting down the pen without signing anything, "I do have questions. Quite a few questions." Camille's eyes narrowed. "Rose, what are you doing?" I stood up slowly, gathering my purse and straightening my shoulders. "I'm leaving, Camille. I'm not signing these papers. I'm not moving into this facility, and I'm certainly not accepting charity from someone who throws away my family history and calls it trash." "You can't just leave, Camille," said, her voice rising slightly. "We've already paid the application fee. Oliver is expecting you to sign today." "Then Oliver is going to be disappointed. Wouldn't be the first time." Director Newman looked bewildered, clearly unused to potential residents walking away from her sales pitch. "Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps you'd like to take some time to think about it. This is a big decision, and sometimes seniors feel overwhelmed by change." "I'm not overwhelmed, Director Newman. I'm insulted. You've spent the last hour talking to me like I'm a confused child who can't make rational decisions about my own life. My daughter-in-law has told you I'm indigent when she has no idea what my financial situation actually is. And both of you seem to think that being 72 automatically makes me incompetent to manage my own affairs." I turned to face Camille directly, letting her see the steel in my eyes that she'd apparently mistaken for weakness all these years. "You want me out of that house so badly, Camille? You think I'm just a useless old woman with nothing but dusty memories and faded photographs? Fine. But you're going to learn that dismissing Rose Whitmore was the biggest mistake you've ever made." Camille stood up as well, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You're making a scene, Rose. People are staring." "Good. Let them stare. Let them see what happens when a family treats their elderly relatives like inconvenient furniture to be stored away in institutions." I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking authoritatively on the polished floor.
Behind me, I could hear Camille apologizing to Director Newman, making excuses about my emotional state, and promising to bring Oliver next time to help convince me. But I was done being convinced, manipulated, or managed. I'd spent 5 years watching Camille systematically dismantle my place in the family, and I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. I'd watched her throw away decades of precious memories, and I'd tried to reason with her. I'd listened to her threaten my mental competence and plan my exile, and I'd still hoped we could find a way to coexist. That hope was gone now, burned away by the casual cruelty of a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her perfect life. But what Camille didn't understand was that obstacles could be surprisingly dangerous when they decided to stop being convenient.
As I walked out of Golden Years Assisted Living Community and into the crisp autumn air of Riverside Heights, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 20 years. When the familiar voice answered, I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Hello, James? This is Rose Whitmore. I think it's time we had that conversation about the Riverside Heights property dispute. Yes, I still have the documentation we discussed. Well, I had it until very recently, but don't worry, I have a plan to get it back, and this time I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what those photographs were worth." Camille thought she'd won by destroying my past and planning my future, but she was about to discover that she'd actually just woken up a sleeping giant who'd been patiently waiting decades for the right moment to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The drive back to Riverside Heights gave me time to think about how I'd ended up in this position. As the familiar landmarks of my hometown passed by my car window, I found myself remembering a conversation I'd had with my grandmother Millicent when I was just 17 years old, sitting in the very same kitchen where Camille and Oliver had dismissed my concerns about the photographs. "Rose, darling," Grandmother Millicent had said, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of Earl Grey tea, "there's something you need to understand about our family that your father never wanted me to tell you. But you're old enough now, and someday this knowledge might be important." That was 1968, and I was more interested in the upcoming senior prom than family history. But something in her tone made me pay attention as she pulled out a small wooden box from behind the flower canister where she kept it hidden. "Your great-grandfather, Ezra Whitmore, was a surveyor for the county back in 1952. He was an honest man, maybe too honest for his own good. When the county commissioners decided they wanted to build the new courthouse complex, they chose a site that included 47 acres of prime land right here in what's now downtown Riverside Heights." I leaned closer, studying the black and white photographs she spread across the kitchen table. They showed a younger version of my great-grandfather standing next to wooden stakes driven into the ground, marking property boundaries with his surveying equipment visible in the background. "The problem was," Grandmother continued, "those 47 acres didn't belong to the county. They belonged to us, to the Whitmore family. Great-grandfather had inherited the land from his father, who'd received it as payment for carpentry work back in the 1890s. The deed was clear, recorded in the county books, everything legal and proper." "So what happened?" I asked, though something in her expression told me the story didn't have a happy ending. "Politics happened, dear. Money happened. The county commissioners decided they wanted that land regardless of who owned it, and they had more lawyers than your great-grandfather could afford to fight. They claimed the old deed was invalid due to some technical filing error, and they took the land through eminent domain for practically nothing." She pointed to one photograph in particular, showing great-grandfather standing next to a massive oak tree with surveying stakes clearly visible in the background. "But your great-grandfather was clever. He knew they might try something like this, so he documented everything, every boundary marker, every tree, every landmark that proved where our property lines really were. He took these pictures the day before the county commissioners came to claim the land."
I studied the photograph more carefully, noticing the careful positioning of the surveying equipment and the way great-grandfather had captured specific details of the landscape. Why didn't he use these to fight them in court? Grandmother's expression grew sad. He tried, Rose. He really did. But in 1952, small-town politics was a dirty business. The county judge was the brother-in-law of one of the commissioners. The county clerk who handled land records was married to another commissioner's son. Your great-grandfather found himself fighting a system that was rigged against him from the start. So we just gave up? He didn't give up, but he got smart. He kept these photographs and all the original documentation, and he told me that someday, when the politics changed and the old corruption was gone, someone in our family would be able to use this evidence to reclaim what was rightfully ours. She carefully gathered the photographs and documents back into the wooden box. The land is worth almost nothing now. It's just empty lots where they tore down some old buildings. But your great-grandfather always said that Riverside Heights would grow, and when it did, that land would become valuable again. At 17, I thought it was just another family story about injustice and missed opportunities. I'd promised to keep the secret, but I'd assumed those photographs would remain just historical curiosities, interesting relics of a different time when things were simpler and less fair. I was wrong about the less fair part. Over the decades, I'd watched downtown Riverside Heights transform from a sleepy county seat into a thriving business district. The empty lots that the county had claimed from my great-grandfather were now some of the most valuable commercial real estate in the region. The old courthouse had been demolished in the 1980s, and the land was sold to developers who built luxury condominiums and high-end shopping centers.
I'd consulted lawyers over the years, but the legal consensus was always the same. Too much time had passed, too many ownership transfers had occurred, and the original documentation wasn't sufficient to challenge decades of established property rights. The photographs, they said, were interesting historical documents, but probably not legally useful after so many years. That changed in 2019 when James Morrison, a real estate attorney specializing in property disputes, took on a case involving similar circumstances in a neighboring county. He'd successfully used historical photographic evidence to prove improper land seizure, winning a settlement of over $3 million for his client's family. When I'd read about his victory in the Riverside Heights Gazette, I'd contacted him immediately. After reviewing copies of great-grandfather Ezra's photographs and documentation, James had been cautiously optimistic about our chances, especially given the recent changes in property law that made historical evidence more admissible in certain circumstances. "Mrs. Whitmore," he'd told me during our consultation, "these photographs are remarkably detailed and well documented. If we can establish a clear chain of ownership and prove that the original eminent domain seizure was improper, you might have a viable claim to significant compensation, if not actual return of the property." But James had also warned me that we'd need the original photographs, not copies, to make the strongest possible case. The age and authenticity of the actual pictures would be crucial in convincing a court that they were legitimate evidence and not modern forgeries. For 25 years, those original photographs had been safely stored in my attic, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I'd planned to tell Oliver about them someday, to share the family secret that could secure his financial future and give him something to be proud of beyond his consulting business and Camille's museum career. Now, thanks to Camille's cleaning frenzy and her dismissal of my old junk, those irreplaceable photographs were buried somewhere in the Riverside Heights municipal landfill. The evidence that could have been worth millions was decomposing alongside banana peels and coffee grounds, destroyed by someone who couldn't see past her own immediate desires. As I pulled into my driveway and sat looking at the Victorian house that had sheltered 4 generations of Whitmore women, I realized that Camille had done more than throw away valuable evidence. She'd severed the connection between past and future that had sustained our family through decades of struggle and triumph. But she'd also underestimated who she was dealing with. I walked through the front door and immediately noticed that changes had already begun in my absence. The antique hall table where I'd always kept fresh flowers had been replaced with a sleek, modern console table that looked like it belonged in a corporate office. The family portraits that had lined the stairway wall were gone, replaced by abstract art prints that had no connection to our history or heritage. "Oliver," I called out, but the house felt empty. A note on the kitchen counter informed me that Oliver and Camille had gone to look at office furniture for his new attic workspace, the space that had previously housed decades of family memories. I climbed the stairs to what had been my bedroom for 40 years and found that it too had been transformed. My personal belongings had been packed into boxes, stacked along one wall, while the rest of the room had been cleared and cleaned as if preparing for new occupants. On the dresser was another brochure for Golden Years Assisted Living, along with a note in Camille's precise handwriting. "Rose, we've started packing to help make your transition easier. Oliver and I are hoping you'll reconsider signing the papers. We only want what's best for you." See, what's best for me? The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked around the room where Harold and I had shared 35 years of marriage, where I'd cried over Oliver's childhood illnesses and celebrated his achievements, where I'd grieved my husband's death and slowly learned to live alone. They'd packed my life into cardboard boxes like I was already gone. I sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone to call James Morrison again. When he answered, I could hear the sounds of a busy law office in the background. "Rose, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Have you decided to move forward with the property claim?" "James, I need to ask you something important. You said we needed the original photographs to make the strongest case. What if those photographs were destroyed? What other options would we have?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Destroyed? Rose, what happened to the photographs?" I explained about Camille's attic cleaning and the trash bags that were now somewhere in the municipal dump. James listened without interrupting, though I could practically hear him wincing as I described watching my family's evidence being treated like garbage. "This is unfortunate," he said finally. "The original photographs would have been our strongest evidence. However, all is not lost. Do you still have the documentation your grandmother showed you? The original deed, the surveyor's notes, any written records from your great-grandfather?" "Some of it," I admitted, "but Camille threw away boxes of materials. I'm not sure what survived and what didn't."
Rose, I need you to go through everything that's left very carefully. Any piece of original documentation from 1952 could be valuable. And there's something else. Do you remember if your great-grandfather ever filed any formal complaints or legal challenges? Sometimes those records survive in county archives, even when family documents are lost. As James spoke, I felt a spark of hope reigniting in my chest. There might be something else, James. My great-grandfather was meticulous about record keeping. If he documented the property boundaries with photographs, he might have also filed copies with other surveyors or government offices. Exactly what I was thinking, Rose. I want you to gather everything you can find, and then I want you to come to my office. We're going to explore every possible avenue for recovering this evidence. And Rose? Yes? Don't mention any of this to your family yet. If there's a viable claim here, we want to build our case carefully before anyone knows what we're doing. After hanging up with James, I sat in my partially packed bedroom and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. For too long, I'd allowed Camille to make me feel like a burden, an inconvenience, a relic from a past that no longer mattered. She'd convinced Oliver that my memories were worthless clutter and my presence was an obstacle to their happiness. But she'd made one crucial mistake. In her eagerness to erase my past, she'd forgotten that the past has a way of fighting back. And now she was about to discover that Rose Whitmore wasn't just some helpless old woman with dusty photographs and faded memories. I was a Whitmore woman, descendant of surveyors and fighters, inheritor of secrets that could change everything. And I was done being convenient. The next morning, I was awakened by the sound of voices in the kitchen below. Oliver and Camille were having what sounded like an intense discussion, their words muffled, but their tones clearly agitated. I checked the clock. It was barely 7 in the morning, which meant something significant had happened to prompt such an early conversation. I dressed quickly. I made my way downstairs, finding them huddled over Oliver's laptop at the kitchen table. Camille looked up as I entered, her face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of anger and panic. "Rose, we need to talk," Oliver said, his voice tight with tension. "Patricia Newman from Golden Years called me yesterday evening. She said you walked out of your orientation meeting and refused to sign the admission papers." "That's correct," I replied calmly, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the pot they had already made. "I decided I wasn't interested in their services." Camille slammed her hand down on the table, making Oliver's laptop jump. "You can't just decide things like that anymore, Rose. We've been planning this for weeks. Oliver took time off work to help coordinate your move. I've already arranged for movers to come next Friday." "Then you'll need to cancel the movers," I said, taking a sip of my coffee, "because I'm not moving anywhere." Oliver ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was frustrated and trying to solve a problem that seemed too big for him. "Mom, we've talked about this. The house is too much for you to handle alone, and Camille and I need the space for our careers." "Your careers," I repeated. "Tell me, Oliver, when did your career become more important than honoring the woman who sacrificed everything to make that career possible?" "That's not fair," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You know I'm grateful for everything you did, but being grateful doesn't mean I have to organize my entire adult life around making you comfortable." The words hit like a slap, but they also clarified something I'd been trying to understand for months. This wasn't just about Camille's ambitions or their need for space. Oliver genuinely believed that I was asking too much by simply wanting to remain in my own home. "I see," I said quietly. "So in your mind, I'm the unreasonable one. I'm the one making excessive demands by wanting to live in the house I've called home for 40 years. Camille leaned forward, her green eyes blazing with frustration. "Rose, you're 72 years old. You have no business living alone in a house this size. What happens when you fall down the stairs? What happens when you have a medical emergency and there's no one here to help you? What happens is the same thing that happens to millions of other independent seniors who manage to live their lives without being warehoused in institutions. They call 911 if necessary, they rely on friends and neighbors, and they maintain their dignity by making their own choices about how to spend the remaining years." Oliver's laptop chimed with an incoming email, and he glanced at the screen. His expression immediately darkened further. "Great. Now I have to deal with this, too." "Deal with what?" Camille asked, moving around to look over his shoulder. "It's from my assistant. Apparently someone called the office yesterday asking questions about my family situation. They wanted to know about my mother's living arrangements and whether there were any concerns about her mental competence."
Oliver looked at me with suspicion creeping into his voice. The caller identified herself as being from Adult Protective Services. She said they'd received a report about an elderly woman who was refusing appropriate care and might be in need of intervention. Camille's face went pale, and I saw her exchange a quick glance with Oliver. The pieces fell into place immediately. Someone had made that call, and I had a very good idea who it was. "You called Adult Protective Services on me," I said, staring directly at Camille. It wasn't a question. "I did what I thought was necessary," she replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "You're clearly not thinking rationally about your situation. Someone needs to look out for your well-being if you won't do it yourself." The casual admission of betrayal was breathtaking. She'd actually called government services to report me as a potentially incompetent elderly person, all to force me out of my home more efficiently. "Camille thought they might be able to help us understand our options," Oliver said, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. "If there are services available to help seniors make better decisions about their living situations."
You mean if there are ways to have me declared incompetent so you can make those decisions for me, I finished. That's not what this is about, Oliver protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We're worried about you, Mom. Your behavior has been concerning lately. The way you reacted to the photo cleanup, your refusal to consider assisted living, your paranoid claims about those pictures being important documents. Paranoid claims. My own son was calling my concerns paranoid to justify what his wife had orchestrated. Oliver, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate calm, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Those photographs that your wife threw away like garbage weren't just family memories. They were legal documentation of our family's ownership of 47 acres of prime downtown Riverside Heights business district real estate. Land that was illegally seized from your great-great-grandfather in 1952 and is now worth approximately $4 million. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the antique wall clock. Oliver stared at me with his mouth slightly open, while Camille's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror as she began to understand what I was saying. "That's impossible," she said weakly. "Those were just old pictures of buildings and trees." Those old pictures showed property boundary markers and survey points that proved our family's legal claim to land in what is now the Riverside Heights business district. I've been consulting with a property attorney for years about pursuing that claim, but we needed the original photographic evidence to make our case. James found his voice first. "Mom, if this is true, why didn't you ever tell me about it?" "Because I was saving it as a surprise for your future. I wanted to wait until the legal case was solid before getting your hopes up. I thought it would be wonderful to hand you a multi-million-dollar settlement as a gift for building your life and starting your family." Camille's hands were shaking now as the full implications hit her. "But we can get them back, right? The garbage hasn't been collected yet. We can go to the dump. We can search." "The garbage was collected 3 days ago," I said flatly. James Morrison, my attorney, explained that after 72 hours in the municipal landfill, any documents would be contaminated beyond legal use, even if we could locate them among tons of refuse. The silence stretched until finally Oliver spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How much did you say the land was worth?" "Approximately $4 million based on current downtown property values, possibly more if we could have proven the case and forced a full development settlement." Camille made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. She sank into her chair as if her legs wouldn't support her anymore. "I threw away $4 million. I threw away our family's entire future," I corrected. "You destroyed documentation that took 70 years to preserve because you couldn't be bothered to ask what was in those boxes before deciding it was junk." Oliver was staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, disappointment, and dawning anger. "Camille, you said you looked through the boxes. You said it was just old pictures and meaningless papers." "I did look through them," she said defensively, though her voice was shaking. "They looked like old family photos. How was I supposed to know they were legal documents?" "You could have asked," I said simply. "You could have shown me what you found before throwing it away. You could have treated my belongings with even minimal respect instead of assuming that everything in my life was worthless." The kitchen fell silent again as the weight of what had happened settled over all of us. Oliver was doing calculations in his head. I could see it in his expression. $4 million would have changed everything for them. It would have paid off their mortgage, funded Camille's career ambitions, secured their children's education, provided for retirement.
Instead, it was decomposing in a landfill because his wife had been too arrogant and impatient to consider that I might have reasons for keeping those boxes. "There has to be something we can do," Oliver said finally. "Other evidence, other documents, something?" "James Morrison is exploring some possibilities," I admitted, "but the photographs were our strongest evidence. Without them, we're looking at a much more difficult and uncertain legal battle." Camille looked up at me with tears in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy for her distress. Rose, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. If I had known. If you had known, you would have been sweet and accommodating until you figured out how to control the money, I said bluntly. Just like you're being sweet and accommodating now that you realize what you've cost your family. That's not true, she protested, but even Oliver was looking at her with new suspicion. Isn't it? I asked. Tell me, Camille, if those photographs had been worth nothing but sentimental value, would you be apologizing right now, or would you still be insisting that I was being unreasonable about clutter? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. I stood up from the table and looked at both of them, my son who had been so eager to warehouse me in an institution, and his wife who had destroyed my family's legacy out of sheer contempt for anything that didn't serve her immediate purposes. I'm going to be staying at the Riverside Heights Grand Hotel for the foreseeable future, I announced. I need time away from both of you to think about what happens next. Mom, you don't have to leave, Oliver said quickly. We can work this out. We can figure out how to fix this. Can we? I asked. Can you fix the fact that you were willing to have me declared mentally incompetent to get me out of your way? Can you fix the fact that your wife called government services to report me as a danger to myself? Can you fix the fact that both of you have spent months treating me like a burden instead of a human being? Neither of them answered. I didn't think so, I said. I'll be in touch when I decide how I want to handle the property situation. In the meantime, I suggest you both think very carefully about the choices you've made and whether this is really the kind of people you want to be. As I walked out of the kitchen for what I knew would be the last time as a resident of that house, I heard Camille burst into tears behind me, but they weren't tears of remorse for how she'd treated me. They were tears of regret for the money she'd thrown away. That told me everything I needed to know about whether there was any hope of salvaging our relationship. There wasn't. The Riverside Heights Grand Hotel had been the pinnacle of luxury when it opened in 1924, and despite nearly a century of changing ownership and renovations, it still maintained an elegance that spoke to a more gracious era. As I settled into the spacious suite on the 7th floor, with its view of the historic downtown district, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. For the first time in years, no one was commenting on my daily routines, criticizing my housekeeping, or making plans for my future without consulting me. The silence of the hotel room wasn't lonely, it was liberating. I spent my first 3 days at the Grand Hotel working with James Morrison's legal team, going through every document I'd managed to salvage from Camille's purge. What we found was both encouraging and frustrating. While the crucial photographic evidence was gone, my great-grandfather Ezra had been even more meticulous than I'd remembered. Rose, look at this, James said during our Thursday morning meeting in his office, spreading several yellow documents across his conference table. Your great-grandfather filed formal complaints with 3 different government agencies between 1952 and 1954. He documented every interaction with county officials, every legal filing, every attempt to negotiate fair compensation. I studied the papers, recognizing my great-grandfather's careful handwriting in the margins, where he'd made notes about meetings and phone calls. He never gave up, did he? Not only did he not give up, but he was smart about it. He made copies of everything and filed them with the State Land Office, the Federal Surveyor's Bureau, and the Attorney General's Office. Some of these records should still exist in state archives. Should exist? James nodded thoughtfully. Government records from that era are hit or miss,
Some have been digitized and carefully preserved. Others have been lost to floods, fires, or simple neglect. But your great-grandfather was thorough enough that we have multiple avenues to explore. That afternoon, while James's research team began the process of requesting archived documents from various government agencies, I decided to take a walk through downtown Riverside Heights. I wanted to see the land that my family should have owned, to understand exactly what Camille's carelessness had cost us.
The Riverside Heights Business District buzzed with activity on that crisp October afternoon. Luxury condominiums towered over boutique shops and upscale restaurants, while well-dressed professionals hurried between modern office buildings. The old oak tree that had marked the corner of our family's property in my great-grandfather's photographs still stood, now surrounded by a small park in the center of the shopping complex. I was standing beneath that oak tree, trying to reconcile the bustling commercial development with the open farmland I'd seen in the old pictures, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Mrs. Whitmore? Rose Whitmore?" I turned to find a woman in her 50s approaching with a warm smile. She had short silver hair and wore the kind of practical clothing that suggested someone who worked with her hands. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" I asked. "Not exactly, but I certainly know who you are. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, head of the Riverside Heights Historical Society. I've been hoping to meet you for years." The name was familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. "The Historical Society?" Dr. Chen nodded enthusiastically. "We've been researching the early development of downtown Riverside Heights, particularly the controversial land acquisitions of the 1950s. Your great-grandfather Ezra Whitmore's case is one of the most well-documented examples of eminent domain abuse from that era." My heart began to race. "You know about my great-grandfather's case?" "Know about it? Mrs. Whitmore, we have an entire file on the Whitmore property dispute. When we were cataloging documents donated by the family of former County Commissioner Wallace Brennan, we found correspondence between the commissioners discussing how to handle your great-grandfather's legal challenges. Some of those letters are quite revealing about the political motivations behind the land seizure." I felt dizzy with sudden hope. "Dr. Chen, would it be possible for me to see those documents?" "Of course! In fact, I was hoping you might be willing to donate some family materials to our collection. We're planning a major exhibition about local land development and property rights. Your family story would be a centerpiece of that display." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the Historical Society's research library, wearing white cotton gloves, while Dr. Chen showed me folders full of documents I'd never seen before. Letters between county commissioners that revealed their deliberate plan to undervalue and seize private land for development. Internal memos discussing how to discredit property owners who challenged their actions. Meeting minutes that showed the entire process had been orchestrated to benefit specific developers who had relationships with county officials. "This is extraordinary," I murmured, reading a letter from Commissioner Brennan to his brother-in-law that explicitly discussed handling the Whitmore problem by questioning Ezra's mental competency and suggesting he was too old to understand modern land development needs. "It gets better," Dr. Chen said, pulling out another folder I hadn't seen yet. "Mrs. Whitmore, we also have some of the original surveyor's reports that your great-grandfather filed with the state. Look at this." She showed me official documents that matched perfectly with the details I remembered from the photographs. Property boundaries, landmark descriptions, even measurements that corresponded exactly to what great-grandfather Ezra had documented with his camera. "Dr. Chen," I said slowly, "would these documents be admissible in a current legal proceeding? I'm not a lawyer, but I know they've been used successfully in similar cases. We had a researcher from the State Attorney General's office here just last month looking for historical land disputes for a statewide investigation into government corruption." I pulled out my phone and called James Morrison immediately. When I explained what I found, he was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. "James, are you still there?" "Rose, I'm here. This is incredible. Can Dr. Chen scan copies of those documents and send them to my office today?" "Dr. Chen?" I looked at the historian who nodded eagerly.
Absolutely! This is exactly the kind of collaboration we hope for with our research collection. When I hung up the phone, Dr. Chen was studying me with a curious expression. Mrs. Whitmore, if you don't mind me asking, what prompted you to pursue this after all these years? I found myself telling her the entire story. Camille's disposal of the photographs, the attempt to force me into assisted living, the devastating realization of what had been lost. Dr. Chen listened with growing amazement and indignation. Your daughter-in-law threw away irreplaceable historical documents? She said when I finished. As a historian, that's almost physically painful to hear. As a grandmother, it's pretty painful too, I replied dryly. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, then pulled out another folder I hadn't seen yet. Mrs. Whitmore, there's something else you should know. We've been working with a documentary filmmaker who's creating a series about property rights and government corruption in small towns. Your family's story, both the historical injustice and the modern destruction of evidence, would be exactly the kind of case they'd want to feature. A documentary? Think about it, Dr. Chen said, warming to the idea. The historical injustice, the family preserving evidence for 70 years and then having it destroyed by someone who couldn't see past their own immediate desires. It's a powerful story about how we value history and family legacy. The idea was intriguing, but I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of public attention. Let me think about it.
As I walked back to the Grand Hotel that evening, my mind was spinning with possibilities. The documents Dr. Chen had shown me might not replace the lost photographs, but they provided crucial corroborating evidence that could strengthen our legal case significantly. More importantly, I'd spent the day being treated with respect and enthusiasm by someone who understood the value of preserving family history. Dr. Chen had looked at the same materials that Camille had dismissed as worthless clutter and immediately recognized their historical and legal significance. Back in my hotel suite, I ordered room service and settled down with the copies of documents that Dr. Chen had provided. As I read through the letters and reports, I began to see a pattern that went beyond just my family's case. The county commissioners had systematically targeted elderly property owners, using their age and assumed ignorance as weapons to facilitate land seizures that benefited their political allies. My great-grandfather hadn't been paranoid or difficult. He'd been fighting a genuinely corrupt system that counted on people like him being too intimidated or too isolated to fight back effectively. The parallel to my current situation wasn't lost on me. Camille and Oliver had used the same tactics, questioning my competency, dismissing my concerns as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman, trying to isolate me from resources and support systems that would allow me to maintain my independence. But unlike my great-grandfather, I wasn't fighting alone. I had James Morrison's legal expertise, Dr. Chen's historical research, and most importantly, I had resources that neither Camille nor Oliver knew about. My phone rang just as I was finishing dinner. Oliver's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Mom, I've been trying to reach you for 3 days. We need to talk." "We talked, Oliver. You made your position quite clear." "Things have changed, Mom. Camille and I have been discussing the situation, and we think we might have been too hasty about some of our decisions." Too hasty. Not wrong, not cruel, not thoughtlessly destructive, just too hasty. "What exactly are you saying, Oliver?" "We want you to come home. We can work out a way to share the house that gives everyone the space they need. And we want to help you pursue the legal case about the property. Maybe we can find other evidence, or maybe the documents you mentioned will be enough." I almost laughed at the transparent motivation behind his sudden change of heart. "And Camille agrees with this new arrangement?" "Camille feels terrible about the photographs. She wants to make it right." "How exactly does Camille propose to make it right, Oliver? Can she travel back in time and ask me about those boxes before throwing them away? Can she undo calling Adult Protective Services to report me as incompetent?"
There was a long pause. Mom, we're family. Families forgive each other and move forward together. You're absolutely right, Oliver. Families do forgive each other. They also respect each other, support each other, and protect each other. When you and Camille are ready to have that kind of family relationship, you know where to find me. I hung up before he could respond and turned off my phone for the night. Tomorrow, James Morrison would begin filing the preliminary paperwork for our property claim, armed with historical documents that might be even more valuable than the photographs Camille had destroyed. And sometime soon, I would decide whether I wanted to share my story with Dr. Chen's documentary filmmaker. But tonight, I sat in my comfortable hotel suite, surrounded by copies of documents that proved my great-grandfather had been right to fight, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of being taken seriously by people who understood that some things are worth preserving. Camille had thought she was throwing away worthless clutter. Instead, she'd forced me to discover that my family's story was more valuable and better documented than I had ever imagined. 1 week after my meeting with Dr. Chen, I was having breakfast in the Grand Hotel's dining room when I spotted a familiar figure across the restaurant. Camille sat at a corner table with 2 other women, their voices low but their body language animated with the kind of intensity that suggested serious gossip was being shared. I recognized her companion immediately. Veronica Hartwell, the wife of Oliver's business partner, and a woman who had never missed an opportunity to remind me that I found my presence at family gatherings to be somewhat beneath the social standards she preferred. The other woman was younger, probably in her early 30s, with the polished appearance of someone who worked in public relations or marketing. I couldn't hear their conversation from across the dining room, but I could see Camille gesturing expressively while the other 2 listened with rapt attention. Every few moments, one of them would glance in my direction, confirming my suspicion that I was the primary topic of their discussion. Rather than feel embarrassed or retreat to my room, I decided to take control of the situation. I finished my breakfast leisurely, signed the check to my room, and then walked directly to their table. "Good morning, Camille," I said pleasantly, noting that all 3 women startled slightly at my approach. "I couldn't help but notice you here. I hope you're enjoying the Grand Hotel's dining room."
Camille's face flushed pink, but she managed to compose herself quickly. Rose, what a surprise. I didn't know you were still staying here. Where else would I be staying? I asked, pulling out the empty 4th chair at their table and sitting down without being invited. You and Oliver made it quite clear that I wasn't welcome in my own home. Veronica Hartwell's eyes widened with barely concealed delight at finding herself in the middle of family drama. Rose, dear, I had no idea there were problems. Camille was just telling us about your situation. My situation, I repeated, looking directly at Camille. How exactly did you describe my situation, dear? The younger woman extended her hand with a professional smile. I'm Jessica Torres from Riverside Heights Social Services. Mrs. Davidson asked me to join them this morning to discuss options for elderly residents who might be struggling with independent living decisions. My blood went cold. Camille hadn't just been gossiping, she'd been building a case. She'd invited a social worker to what was clearly intended to be an intervention, disguised as a casual breakfast meeting. How thoughtful of Mrs. Davidson to arrange such a meeting without consulting me, I said, my voice remaining calm despite the fury building in my chest. Tell me, Ms. Torres, what exactly has Camille told you about my supposed struggles with independent living? Jessica Torres glanced uncertainly between Camille and me, clearly sensing that this conversation wasn't going as planned.
Well, she mentioned that you've been refusing appropriate housing assistance, that there were concerns about your ability to maintain your previous residence, and that family members were worried about some behavioral changes. Behavioral changes? I said, turning to stare at Camille. What kind of behavioral changes? Camille's composure was beginning to crack under my direct gaze. Rose, we're all just concerned about you. Living alone in a hotel isn't a long-term solution, and your resistance to discussing reasonable alternatives suggests that you might not be thinking clearly about your options. I see. And did you mention to Ms. Torres that the reason I'm living in a hotel is because you and my son decided to force me out of my home so you could convert it to your personal office space? Veronica Hartwell leaned forward with obvious fascination at this unexpected turn of events. Office space? Camille, you didn't mention anything about Rose being asked to leave the house. It's not that simple, Camille said quickly. The house needs extensive renovations, and it's really too large for one elderly person to maintain safely. We offered Rose a lovely apartment at Golden Years Assisted Living, but she refused to even consider it. After you threw away 43 years of my family photographs and called them garbage, I added helpfully. Jessica Torres was taking notes now, and I could see her reassessing the situation as she wrote. Mrs. Whitmore, can you tell me about these photographs? Were they important to you for sentimental reasons? They were important for legal reasons, I said clearly. They contained documentation of a property dispute that could have been worth millions of dollars to my family. Unfortunately, Mrs. Davidson disposed of them without asking what they were. The silence that followed was profound. Veronica Hartwell's mouth fell open, while Jessica Torres stopped writing and looked up at me with sharp attention. "Millions of dollars?" Veronica finally managed to say. Property documentation from the 1950s proving my family's ownership of what is now prime downtown real estate. I'd been working with an attorney for years to build a case for recovering that land. The photographs were crucial evidence. Camille's face had gone white. Rose, you're exaggerating. You never said anything about millions of dollars. Because I wanted it to be a surprise for Oliver's future. I thought it would be wonderful to present him with a multi-million-dollar settlement as a gift. Instead, his wife threw away the evidence because she couldn't be bothered to ask what was in those boxes before declaring them worthless. Jessica Torres set down her pen and looked directly at Camille. Mrs. Davidson, making false reports to social services is a serious matter. If Mrs. Whitmore's claims about the property documentation are legitimate, then your characterization of her mental state appears to have been deliberately misleading. That's not exactly what I said. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, that's exactly what you said. Ms. Torres, I've been working with James Morrison, a property attorney specializing in historical land disputes. Would you like his contact information so you can verify that my claims about the legal case are accurate? I handed her James's business card, which I'd started carrying after our first meeting. Jessica Torres studied it carefully, then looked back at Camille with an expression that had shifted from professional concern to professional skepticism. Mrs. Davidson, making false reports to social services is a serious matter. If Mrs. Whitmore's claims about the property documentation are legitimate, then your characterization of her mental state appears to have been deliberately misleading. I was concerned about her welfare, Camille said defensively, but her voice lacked conviction. She was living alone, refusing help, making claims that seemed unrealistic.
Claims that are apparently being taken seriously by a property attorney, Jessica Torres interrupted. Mrs. Whitmore, are you currently working with legal counsel to pursue this property matter? I am. In fact, we've recently discovered additional historical documentation that supports our case. The Riverside Heights Historical Society has been extremely helpful in providing corroborating evidence. Jessica Torres stood up abruptly. Mrs. Davidson, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about this situation. Mrs. Whitmore appears to be managing her affairs competently and has legitimate legal representation. I don't see any basis for social services intervention. She turned to me with an apologetic expression. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry you were put in this position. If you have any concerns about how this referral was made, I'd encourage you to contact my supervisor. As Jessica Torres gathered her papers and left the table, the tension between Camille, Veronica, and me became almost unbearable. Veronica was staring at Camille with undisguised shock, while Camille looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Camille, Veronica said slowly, you told me that Rose was becoming difficult and irrational. You said she was refusing reasonable help and making up stories about valuable items being thrown away. You didn't mention anything about legal documentation or property disputes. Because I didn't think they were real, Camille said weakly. They looked like old family pictures. Did you ask Rose what they were before throwing them away? Veronica pressed. Camille didn't answer, which was answer enough. I stood up from the table, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. Ladies, thank you for such an illuminating breakfast conversation. Veronica, I hope this gives you a more accurate understanding of my situation. Camille, I hope you're beginning to understand the consequences of making assumptions about things you don't understand. As I walked away from the table, I heard Veronica's voice behind me, no longer bothering to keep her volume low. Camille! You called social services on Oliver's mother because she wouldn't move out of her own house, and you threw away documents worth millions of dollars. What were you thinking? I didn't stay to hear Camille's response, but I could imagine the conversation that would follow. Veronica Hartwell was one of the biggest gossips in Riverside Heights social circles, and by evening half the town would know that Camille Davidson had cost her family millions of dollars and then tried to have her elderly mother-in-law declared incompetent to cover up her mistake. Back in my hotel suite, I called James Morrison to update him on the morning's events. Rose, this is actually helpful for our case, he said, after I'd recounted the conversation. If Camille has been making false reports about your mental competency to government agencies, it establishes a pattern of harassment that could support our position if Oliver tries to challenge your legal standing in the property dispute. Do you think he would do that? Given what you've told me about his recent behavior, I think we should be prepared for any possibility. The good news is that Jessica Torres's notes will show that the social services referral was based on false information. That documentation could be valuable if we need it. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Chen at the Historical Society. Rose, I have exciting news. The documentary filmmaker I mentioned wants to meet with you next week. But more importantly, we've heard back from the state archives. They've located several boxes of records from the Riverside County Commissioner's Office from the 1950s, including files specifically related to your great-grandfather's case. What kind of files? Meeting minutes, correspondence, legal filings, all the official documentation of how they handled his property dispute. Rose, some of these documents support everything your great-grandfather claimed about the corruption and political manipulation involved in the land seizure. I felt a surge of vindication for great-grandfather Ezra, who had spent his final years fighting a system that everyone told him was fair and legitimate. He'd been right all along, and now, 70 years later, his great-granddaughter was finally going to prove it. Dr. Chen, there's something else you should know.
I had an interesting encounter this morning with my daughter-in-law and a social worker she had contacted to report me as mentally incompetent. I told her about the breakfast meeting and Camille's attempt to build a case for intervention. Dr. Chen listened with growing outrage. "That's unconscionable," she said when I finished. "Rose, would you be willing to share this story with the documentary filmmaker? This isn't just about historical property rights anymore. It's about how elderly people are treated when their families want to control their lives and assets." I thought about my great-grandfather who had died still fighting for justice that never came. I thought about all the other elderly people who might be facing similar manipulation and dismissal from families who saw them as inconveniences, rather than human beings with rights and dignity. "Yes," I said finally. "I think it's time people heard the whole story." That evening, as I watched the sunset over downtown Riverside Heights from my hotel window, I realized that Camille's attempt to discredit me had actually backfired completely. Instead of making me look incompetent, she'd exposed herself as someone willing to lie to government agencies to get what she wanted.
Instead of isolating me, she'd connected me with people like Dr. Chen and James Morrison who respected my intelligence and valued my family's history. Instead of silencing me, she'd given me a platform to tell a story that needed to be heard. Camille had thought she was playing chess, but she'd been playing checkers all along, and now it was my turn to make the next move. 2 weeks after the breakfast confrontation, I was sitting in James Morrison's conference room when his assistant knocked on the door with an urgent expression. "Mr. Morrison, you need to see this," she said, handing him a tablet. "It's about the Whitmore case." James looked at the screen, his eyebrows rising steadily as he read. "Rose, it appears your daughter-in-law has decided to take this public." He turned the tablet toward me, showing a blog post on a popular local website called Riverside Heights Community Voice. The headline read, "Elderly Mother Refuses Family Help, Claims Trash Worth Millions." I felt my stomach drop as I began reading Camille's carefully crafted narrative. According to her version of events, I was a confused elderly woman who had become increasingly paranoid and difficult after my husband's death. She described my hoarding tendencies and my irrational attachment to worthless old photographs. Most damaging of all, she portrayed herself and Oliver as concerned family members who were desperately trying to get help for a beloved mother who refuses to acknowledge her declining mental state. "She's trying to control the narrative," James said grimly. "This is actually a sophisticated character assassination disguised as a plea for sympathy." The comment section was already filling up with responses. Most readers seemed to sympathize with Camille's apparent plight, offering advice about dealing with difficult elderly relatives and sharing their own stories about family members who had lost touch with reality in their later years. "James, can we sue her for this?" "Possibly, but there's a better approach. She's made several factual claims in this post that we can definitively disprove. Rather than trying to silence her, let's correct the record publicly." That afternoon, Dr. Chen called with more unwelcome news. "Rose, I'm afraid Camille contacted our office yesterday. She wanted to know what documents we have related to your family's property dispute. She claimed to be calling on your behalf to help organize your legal case." "What did you tell her?" Nothing, of course. We don't share research materials with anyone except the documented family member who's been working with us. But she was very persistent, and she seemed to think she had some kind of authority to access your materials because of your son's legal ownership of the family house." I felt a chill of recognition. Camille was building a case to have me declared incompetent, and she needed evidence that my claims about the property were delusional. If she could prove that the Historical Society had no relevant documents, it would support her narrative that I was making up stories about valuable evidence. "Dr. Chen, I think it's time to move forward with that documentary interview, and I think we need to do it very publicly."
3 days later, I found myself sitting across from documentary filmmaker Marcus Reeves in the main reading room of the Riverside Heights Public Library. Dr. Chen had arranged the interview to be conducted in public, with advance notice to local media about the Historical Property Rights Documentation Project. Marcus was a slight man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you have a remarkable story about both historical injustice and modern family conflict. Can you start by telling me about your great-grandfather? For the next 2 hours, I told the complete story, from Ezra's original land ownership and the corrupt county seizure in 1952, through my decades of preserving the evidence, to Camille's destruction of the photographs and subsequent attempts to discredit me. Mrs. Whitmore, Marcus said as we neared the end of the interview, I understand there's been some public discussion about your mental competency and the validity of your claims. How do you respond to suggestions that you're making up stories about valuable evidence? I respond by presenting facts, I said calmly. I turned to Dr. Chen, who was sitting nearby with several folders of documents. Dr. Chen, could you please show Mr. Reeves the correspondence we found from County Commissioner Brennan? Dr. Chen handed Marcus a protective sleeve containing the 1952 letter that explicitly discussed strategies for handling the Whitmore problem. Marcus read it carefully, his expression growing more serious with each line. This letter discusses deliberate strategies to discredit your great-grandfather by questioning his mental competency. The parallels to your current situation are remarkable. They're not just remarkable, they're intentional, I replied. When people want to take something from an elderly person, whether it's land, money, or simply autonomy, the easiest strategy is to convince everyone else that the elderly person is no longer competent to make their own decisions. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message from Oliver. Mom, please call me. We need to discuss this interview before you say something you'll regret. I showed the message to Marcus, who asked, Would you like to call your son now, on camera? Actually, yes. I think it's time for a completely honest conversation. I dialed Oliver's number and put the phone on speaker. When he answered, his voice was tight with anxiety.
Mom, people are telling me you're doing some kind of public interview about our family situation. This is humiliating for all of us. Oliver, I'm sitting here with a documentary filmmaker, a historian, and several members of the local media. We're discussing the property documentation that your wife threw away and her subsequent attempts to have me declared mentally incompetent. Would you like to comment on any of that for the record? There was a long silence. Mom, you're making our private family business into a public spectacle. Your wife made it public when she posted that blog article calling me delusional, I replied. I'm simply correcting the record with facts. What facts? You're talking about property claims that may or may not be legitimate, based on documents that may or may not have been important. Dr. Chen leaned toward the phone. Mr. Davidson, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from the Riverside Heights Historical Society. I can confirm that your mother's claims about the historical documentation are entirely accurate. We have corroborating evidence from county archives that supports everything she's told you about your great-great-grandfather's case. Another silence, followed by Oliver's voice, now clearly strained. Dr. Chen, my wife was trying to help my mother organize her belongings. She had no way of knowing that random old photographs might be legally significant. Mr. Davidson, Marcus Reeves interjected, did your wife ask your mother what those photographs were before disposing of them? That's not the point. The point is that Mom is turning a family disagreement into a public circus. Oliver, I said quietly, the point is that your wife destroyed irreplaceable evidence worth millions of dollars, then tried to have me declared mentally incompetent when I objected to being forced out of my home. Those aren't family disagreements. Those are deliberate actions designed to control my life and my assets. Mom, you're living in a hotel and spending money on lawyers for a property case that might not even be winnable. How is that rational behavior? Marcus gestured for Dr. Chen to respond.
Mr. Davidson, your mother's legal team has made significant progress on the property case, particularly with the additional archival evidence we've provided. The case appears to be quite strong. And, I added, I'm living in a hotel because I can afford to live in a hotel. Oliver, you and Camille have been assuming I'm some elderly woman living on Social Security who needs your financial support. You have no idea what my actual resources are. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, then held it toward the camera. I mean that I've been managing my own finances quite successfully for decades. I own 3 rental properties in downtown Riverside Heights, I have a diversified investment portfolio, and I have enough liquid assets to live comfortably in this hotel for years if I choose to. The silence on the phone stretched so long that I thought Oliver had hung up. Oliver? Are you still there? You have rental properties? Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about this? Because I was saving those assets for your inheritance, just like I was saving the property documentation for your future. I wanted to surprise you with financial security instead of burdening you with the responsibility of caring for me. Marcus was taking notes rapidly, clearly recognizing the dramatic irony of the situation. Mrs. Whitmore, so your son and daughter-in-law were trying to force you into assisted living while you actually have the resources to live independently anywhere you chose? That's correct. They assumed I was financially dependent on them, so they felt entitled to make decisions about my living situation without consulting me. Dr. Chen added, and when Mrs. Whitmore tried to explain the importance of the family documents, they dismissed her concerns as the confused rambling of an elderly woman who couldn't distinguish between valuable evidence and worthless clutter. Oliver's voice came through the phone speaker, now barely above a whisper. Mom, I had no idea. You always seem to be struggling financially. I lived modestly because I was saving for your future, Oliver. I drove an old car and shopped at discount stores because I wanted to leave you as much as possible. I never imagined that my frugal lifestyle would be used as evidence that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. Marcus leaned toward the phone. Mr. Davidson, would you like to respond to your mother's account of these events? I need to talk to Camille. I need to understand how this all got so out of hand. Oliver, I said gently, it got out of hand because both of you made assumptions about me instead of treating me like a competent adult who deserved to be consulted about decisions affecting my life. After I hung up, Marcus sat back in his chair with an expression of amazement. Mrs. Whitmore, I have been making documentaries about family conflict and elder abuse for 15 years, and I've never seen a case of such clear financial and emotional manipulation disguised as concern. Will this interview be helpful for other families dealing with similar situations? Absolutely. Your story illustrates perfectly how elderly people can be victimized by their own families, particularly when those families assume that age automatically equals incompetence.
That evening, back in my hotel suite, I received a flood of phone calls and messages. The local news had picked up the story, and social media was buzzing with discussions about elder rights and family responsibility. Most surprisingly, I heard from several other elderly residents of Riverside Heights who had faced similar pressures from adult children who wanted to control their living situations and assets. But the call that mattered most came from Oliver at nearly midnight. Mom, I owe you an enormous apology. Camille and we handled everything wrong. We made assumptions, we didn't listen to you, and we treated you like you were incapable of making your own decisions. Oliver, I appreciate that, but apologies don't restore destroyed evidence or undo the humiliation of being reported to social services as mentally incompetent. I know. And Mom, there's something else you need to know. After watching that interview online, I realized that Camille has been manipulating both of us. She convinced me that you were becoming irrational and needed intervention, but now I can see that she was the one pushing every decision that took away your autonomy.
I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. What are you going to do about that realization, Oliver? I don't know yet, but I do know that I want to find a way to make this right with you, if that's possible. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. I'd gone from being dismissed as a confused, elderly woman to being recognized as someone with a legitimate legal case and an important story to tell. But more importantly, I'd rediscovered my own voice and my own power in a way that I hadn't felt since Harold died. Camille had thought she could control the narrative about my life, but she'd underestimated both my resources and my resilience. Tomorrow, James Morrison would file our official property claim armed with documentation that proved 70 years of government corruption and cover-up. And sometime next week, Marcus's documentary interview would air on the local public television station, ensuring that everyone in Riverside Heights understood exactly what had happened to Rose Whitmore and why it mattered. Camille had wanted to make this a public battle. She was about to discover that she'd picked a fight with the wrong grandmother. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Riverside Heights County Courthouse, holding a check for $3.2 million. James Morrison had just emerged from the final settlement conference with a smile that told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. James Morrison, he said, his voice filled with the satisfaction that comes from a hard-fought victory. The county agreed to the full settlement amount, plus legal fees, plus a formal apology for the 1952 land seizure. The legal battle had been swifter than anyone expected. Once the archival evidence from the Historical Society was combined with the documentation James's team had uncovered, the county's legal position had crumbled rapidly. The current county commissioners, eager to avoid the political scandal of a prolonged court case about historical corruption, had opted for a generous settlement rather than risk a public trial. What happens now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. James and I had discussed this moment many times over the past months. Now, you decide what you want to do with your life, he said simply. You have the financial security to live however and wherever you choose. As we walked out of the courthouse together, I reflected on how dramatically everything had changed since that morning when Camille had thrown my photographs into the trash. The documentary about my case had aired 3 months ago, sparking a statewide conversation about elder rights and family manipulation. I'd received hundreds of letters from other elderly people who had faced similar situations, and several had successfully used my story as a template for asserting their own independence. Dr. Chen had been right about the historical significance of the case. The documentary had won a regional Emmy Award, and the Historical Society was now developing a permanent exhibition about property rights and government corruption that would feature my family story prominently. But the most significant change had been in my relationship with Oliver. 2 weeks after the documentary aired, he had appeared at my hotel room with divorce papers in his hand and tears in his eyes. Mom, I filed for divorce from Camille yesterday. I can't live with someone who would treat you the way she did, and I can't forgive myself for going along with it. The divorce had been finalized just last month. Camille that moved back to her parents' house in the neighboring town of Millbrook, taking with her the modern furniture and abstract art that had briefly replaced my family heirlooms. Oliver had remained in the Victorian house, slowly working to restore it to the warm family home it had been before Camille's renovations. "Rose!" I heard a familiar voice calling across the courthouse lobby. Oliver was hurrying toward us, having driven from his office the moment James called with news of the settlement. "Mom, congratulations!" he said, embracing me with genuine warmth. "I'm so proud of you for fighting this battle and winning."
The relationship between Oliver and me was still healing, but it was healing.
He had spent the past 6 months learning to see me as an independent person rather than a burden to be managed, and I had slowly learned to trust that his change of heart was genuine rather than motivated by the prospect of inheriting money. "Oliver, I want you to know that this settlement doesn't change what I told you before," I said as we walked toward the parking garage. "I'm not planning to live in the house again. It's yours, just as we always planned." "Mum, after everything that's happened, are you sure you don't want to come home? I've been working to put everything back the way it was before." I smiled and squeezed his arm. "That's very sweet, but I've discovered something important over these past months. I like my independence. I like being able to make my own decisions about how to spend my time without considering anyone else's needs or schedules." This was true in ways I was still discovering. Living in the Grand Hotel had shown me that I enjoyed the freedom of not being responsible for maintaining a large house. I liked having my meals prepared by someone else, having my rooms cleaned by housekeeping staff, and being able to travel or stay out late without worrying about home security. "What are you going to do?" Oliver asked. "I'm going to buy a condominium in the new Riverside Heights luxury living complex," I said. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a view of the river, and full concierge services. I'll be 5 minutes away from you, but I'll have my own space and my own life. We reached my car and Oliver hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Mom, I know I can't undo the mistakes I made, but I want you to know that I've learned something important from all of this." "What's that?" "That being someone's son doesn't give me the right to make decisions about their life, and that age doesn't automatically make someone incompetent or burdensome." It was a lesson that had cost our family dearly to learn, but I was grateful that Oliver had learned it while there was still time to rebuild our relationship. 3 weeks later, I was signing papers for my new condominium when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Camille's name, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Rose, I heard about the settlement," she said, her voice carefully controlled but strained. "I wanted to call and apologize." "For which part, Camille? For throwing away irreplaceable family documents? For calling social services to report me as mentally incompetent? For trying to force me out of my home? Or for posting false information about me online?" There was a long pause. "For all of it. I was wrong about everything, and I cost our family millions of dollars because I was too arrogant to ask questions before making assumptions." "Our family?" I repeated. "Camille, you divorced yourself out of this family when you chose your convenience over my dignity." "I know, and I know you probably can't forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did wrong." "What's that?" "That being someone's son doesn't give me the right to make decisions about their life, and that age doesn't automatically make someone incompetent or burdensome." It was a lesson that had cost our family dearly to learn, but I was grateful that Oliver had learned it while there was still time to rebuild our relationship. 3 weeks later, I was signing papers for my new condominium when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Camille's name, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Rose, I heard about the settlement," she said, her voice carefully controlled but strained. "I wanted to call and apologize." "For which part, Camille? For throwing away irreplaceable family documents? For calling social services to report me as mentally incompetent? For trying to force me out of my home? Or for posting false information about me online?" There was a long pause. "For all of it. I was wrong about everything, and I cost our family millions of dollars because I was too arrogant to ask questions before making assumptions." "Our family," I repeated. "Camille, you divorced yourself out of this family when you chose your convenience over my dignity." "I know, and I know you probably can't forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did wrong." "What's that?" "That being someone's son doesn't give me the right to make decisions about their life, and that age doesn't automatically make someone incompetent or burdensome." It was a lesson that had cost our family dearly to learn, but I was grateful that Oliver had learned it while there was still time to rebuild our relationship. I considered her words carefully. Camille sounded genuinely remorseful, but I had learned to be skeptical of her motivations.
What do you understand that you did wrong? I asked. I treated you like you were already dead. I acted like your life and your memories and your independence didn't matter because you were old. I convinced myself that I was helping you, but really I was just trying to get you out of the way so I could have the life I wanted without inconvenience. It was a more honest assessment than I had expected from her. And what made you realize this? Watching the documentary, seeing how other families talked about their elderly relatives, and recognizing that I had become exactly the kind of person I always said I would never be. Camille, I appreciate your apology, but understanding what you did wrong doesn't undo the consequences. Those photographs can never be replaced. The months of stress and humiliation can't be erased. And most importantly, the trust between us can't be rebuilt. I know. And I know you probably can't forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I realize what I lost. Not just the money, but the chance to be part of a family with someone who had lived through so much history and had so much wisdom to share. After hanging up with Camille, I sat in my new condominium's living room, looking out at the Riverside River and thinking about forgiveness. I didn't hate Camille anymore. The anger had burned out of me during the legal battle. But I also didn't feel obligated to absolve her or welcome her back into my life. Some damage is simply too extensive to repair, and some lessons come too late to matter. A month after moving into my new home, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Chen arrived at my door with a manila envelope and an excited expression. Rose, you're not going to believe this. We've been contacted by the Smithsonian Institution. They want to acquire some of the documents from your great-grandfather's case for their collection on American land rights and government corruption.
I opened the envelope to find a formal letter from the National Museum of American History expressing interest in displaying Ezra Whitmore's surveyor notes and correspondence as part of a traveling exhibition about property rights in small-town America. They're offering a substantial donation to the Historical Society in exchange for the right to display copies of the documents, Dr. Chen continued, and they want to interview you about the modern implications of your case for their oral history project. The Smithsonian wants to interview me? Rose, your story has become a case study in elder law schools across the country. The combination of historical injustice and modern family manipulation illustrates several important legal and social issues that scholars are studying. As I read through the Smithsonian's letter, I realized that my great-grandfather's fight for justice had finally achieved something he could never have imagined. His careful documentation of corruption and his refusal to give up had ultimately led to not just financial compensation for our family, but to educational resources that might help other families avoid similar conflicts. That evening, I called Oliver to tell him about the Smithsonian's interest in our family's story. "Mom, that's incredible," he said. "Great-great-grandfather Ezra would be amazed to know that his surveyor's notes ended up in a national museum." "I think he'd be amazed by a lot of things about how this story ended," I replied. "He fought his whole life for justice that he never lived to see, but in the end, his persistence paid off for his family." "Do you think he would have approved of how we handled things?" It was a thoughtful question from Oliver, and I considered it carefully before answering. "I think he would have been disappointed by how long it took us to fight back, but proud that we eventually stood up for what was right." 6 months later, I attended the opening of the Smithsonian exhibition featuring my great-grandfather's documents and photographs of the original oak tree boundary marker. Standing in front of the display case containing his surveyor's notes and photographs of the original oak tree boundary marker, I felt a profound connection to the man who had started this fight 70 years ago. The exhibition placard read, "The Whitmore Case: How One Family's Persistence Exposed Decades of Government Corruption and Inspired Modern Elder Rights Advocacy." Next to the historical documents was a small monitor playing excerpts from my documentary interview, including the moment when I revealed my financial independence and challenged assumptions about elderly competence. A young woman with her elderly grandmother stopped next to me to read the display. "Grandma, this lady sounds like you," the young woman said. "She didn't let people push her around just because she was older." The grandmother smiled and looked directly at me. "Sometimes it takes a long time to find your voice, but once you do, it's important to use it." As I walked through the rest of the exhibition, surrounded by the stories of other Americans who had fought for their rights against overwhelming odds, I reflected on how much my life had changed in 2 years. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating mother-in-law who swallowed her pride to keep peace in the family. I was Rose Whitmore, property rights advocate, documentary subject, and independent woman who had learned that age is not a disqualification from living life on your own terms. I had discovered that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not for what you can gain, but for who you refuse to let others force you to become. And most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, even when everyone around you insists that your time of making decisions has passed. Camille thought she was throwing away old junk when she discarded my photographs. Instead, she had given me the greatest gift possible, the motivation to reclaim my voice, my independence, and my right to be treated with dignity. Some treasures can only be discovered when everything else is stripped away, and sometimes the most valuable thing you can inherit from your ancestors isn't money or property, but the stubborn refusal to give up when you know you're right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.